I think it is funny how many people continue to think that there is some kind of coherent and meaningful mind stuff that is independent of language. I mean, why does someone have to use the word mind stuff? Why use the word mental? Why use the word thought? Those are all just more words. I mean, is there really some sort of stuff there independent of the language? There obviously might be something there. Are there cognitions? Are there images? Are there desires and hopes and aspirations? And I think we can differentiate between like a fantasy image and a memory or a dream. And all of those are seem to be other than words. But right here, could I have organized and cataloged and understood all those differences without those words? And are those things supposedly that are being referred to by the words, what are they? Are they just there? Are there like rocks in the shoebox just being cataloged and classified and labeled by the different words? What's their status when they're not there being talked about? I think part of the problem is that we so rely upon our sense of sight and have so dislodged sight from sound, from our sense of hearing, that we imagine ourselves as simply given in visual space as something wholly seen and seeable. And then from there, we act as just things in space. We're communicating with other people by we take what's inside us, we take, I guess, this thought stuff, and then we put it into a cloak of language, like it's a container of some sort, and then we pass it over to the other person, and then they take the words or the language and then they pull it out into, or they put their own thought into it, they take their own thought out of it. I'm not really sure how the reception happens, but I think the general sense that people seem to have out there is that, again, we're things in space, and then the process of communication is one of encoding thought stuff that's separate from and different from language, putting it into language, and then sending it over to other people in some way, and then they copy it, they take something from it, they attribute something to it. I don't know, all of that, I guess, gets a little sketchy for those people who hold that kind of model. I think part of the problem could be shaken out this way. I mean, people want to say that is there this stuff that's unencoded thought? What does it look like? This stuff that is thought stuff that isn't yet talked about, that isn't yet caught within the net or frame of language, and that couldn't be talked about, what exactly would that be? Who could say what is independent of language? Doesn't it seem like that just doesn't even make any sense? Well, it seems like it makes sense, but that's part of the problem. Take the case of, maybe here's a different way to come at it. Let's take thought. Now, obviously, there's lots of kinds of thought. Let's agree it, right? I mean, I think lots of people would want to say there's lots of kinds of thought. There are images that we have. There are volitions and intentions. There are dreams and memories. And then there are also those ongoing events of dialogue where we talk to ourselves, we engage in a kind of speech with ourselves, we tell ourselves how things are, and in those acts, it seems kind of odd. It's as if the person doing the sending and the person doing the receiving, well, if communication is just an encoding and a decoding, and there's just self-talk where one person, like, you're there and you're talking to yourself, you're telling yourself how things are. I mean, watch yourself in your own thought. How often is your own thought sort of telling yourself how things are? You say, oh, this is this and this is that. Well, the person sending it, purportedly, you'd think, is the same as the person receiving it. Well, then why even go through with it? Well, I'm not suggesting that there's no such thing as self-talk. I think self-talk makes sense. The point is that you're not just a thing in space. You are a temporal unfolding, and speech is the way that thought accomplishes and articulates itself, and it is an ongoing event of interpretation whereby you mediate the self who you were and the self who you're becoming. You're riding between that by way of a thought that's actually articulating and accomplishing itself by way of the speech, by way of articulated breath. It's an event. Thought itself accomplishes itself as an event of articulation and of speech. There isn't some thought. The illusion of a thought that precedes speech is speech already spoken that now is recalled. What you call the thought that you're going to encode was some sort of sign, some sort of image, some sort of something. I mean, part of the problem is that we have words like something. Well, we have all these vague words, stuff, something. I'm not sure what it was, but it was something. Thought can be nebulous, and we can tolerate its nebulousness, but only because of we have words. It's the fact that we have words that allows us to take what would otherwise be an ongoing unfolding of just enmeshed experience. It's funny, whenever we try to talk about what's independent of language, we kind of go, okay, well, there's language, but then, without language, there would just be blah, and then we start to say, and then we try to give our best description. We try to talk about immersion or absorption or recessing back into the world without the division between subject and object, or we talk about becoming invisible, or we talk about receding into the background and without any sense of ego and sense of self, or we talk about the way we get lost in a movie or in play, or the way that we could recover childhood games, or the way that people immerse themselves into some project or engagement where they lose themselves in the process. All these different ways of talking, right? They're different ways of trying to say what is independent of language, but we're always using language to do it. We forget that the language is going on, right? Sometimes when you're driving and you're sort of like there and you're driving, and you're maybe not aware of the fact that you're driving, and suddenly you park the car and you're like, wow, I hardly remember the driving. It's sort of like you were so engaged in the thought that your driving was almost, I mean, not really, but it was almost on autopilot. There are other times when you're so attentive to the driving and you're so carefully watching what's going on that you don't keep awareness of the fact that you were talking to yourself, that is thinking, but you weren't really explicitly aware of that fact. I think we can just as much be on autopilot with our practices while we're attending to our thought as we can be an autopilot with our thought while we're attending to our practices. They're both different practices. That is, thought is a practice of talking to oneself, and our outward bodily practices, whether it's woodwork or handiwork or for me juggling or something like this. You can do all of these things, either one level of both speech, thought, or manual practices can be to various degrees on a kind of autopilot, with the other one being relatively what one is attending to. I think the larger point, though, is that there isn't some thought stuff independent of what we say about it. Now, if there is, and I think even if we grant that there is, you just can't say what that is. I mean, and I think the point is, even if you could say what it is, that misses the point. The larger point, the real significant point, is that you're not just a thing in space. You're an event of time, and only by way of language could you counsel yourself. Only by way of language can you right now help that you who you're going to one day wake up and be. How can you realize and deal with that relation?